Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the 7th episode of the story, and when Naruto's father met his mother, his first thought was that a village out there must be missing its idiot. This story is from Silver Shine. Please support him, her. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. The cart had not been a smooth ride, and Minato thought he had been sorely misled about the terrain of the Wind Country. There were songs about this place, that waxed on about the columns of sand dunes and the ever-changing face of the landscape, but the driver insisted that was only true to the far west of Suna. East of Suna, where they traveled, was only a flat, barren landscape where the parched earth cracked and the only signs of life were a couple of cacti and some dry, dead-looking bushes. Minato hid in the paltry shade of his hood, sweltering quietly. This was probably what Kushina felt like on those hot days in Konoha. Except down here nearer the equator, the sun seemed twice as large and twice as hot as the sun back home, and Minato had already finished his supply of water and had started on Tsukumo's. The older Jonin didn't appear to mind. In fact, he seemed impervious to the harsh climate of the desert, sitting bolt upright in his seat with his face turned into the light, eyes closed like a dozing lion. Of course, he was going to be far more at ease with this temperature since while Minato had been splashing around in the bogs of the Far East during the war, Hokage Tsukumo had been in this very desert, fighting Suna. Given such a history, Minato wondered about the wisdom of sending someone like Tsukumo on a peaceful exchange program. It had to be rather like sending Minato as part of a peaceful envoy to the Mist Village, knowing he'd killed one of their finest generals, savaged their strongest outpost, and overall struck a very humiliating blow. The Hokage seemed to think it was an appropriate choice, however, and the Hokage's word was always final. Minato knew because he had done this best to wriggle out of this program for some very good reasons. The first was that Hokage Tsukumo didn't like him. They'd traveled together for 3 days now and it had been an almost entirely silent journey, save for that hour when Tsukumo had listed all the things that could and would kill Minato in this country, ranging from flathead snakes and red flies, to simple things like standing outside for more than 4 hours without water, a list which Tsukumo had enjoyed relaying far too much. It was true that after the guinea pig incident it was understandable for Tsukumo to be especially frosty towards him, but altogether Minato thought very little harm had been done. Not when, after having the cruel facts of death spelled out for him, Kakashi had merely turned to Minato with wide eyes and asked when he would be getting a replacement pet. The other reason was because he really hadn't wanted to leave Kushina behind. When he'd left, he'd made her promise to put her troubling conviction to leave the village aside, at least until he got back. No one else he spoke to was taking it any more seriously than an ordinary tiff. Mikoto believed she'd had an argument with Run, but her blues would soon wear off. Run, when Minato forced himself to approach him, was flippant and refused to accept that there was anything wrong with Kushina at all, which Minato viewed as the best evidence that Ren was responsible, as well as a bastard. And when he had casually mentioned Kushina's compulsive plan to Tsukumo as they set off for Suna, her teacher had merely shrugged and said, "She can't leave the village," as if that was that and there was no more to it. So although Minato was faintly relieved when the high, sandstone walls of Suna appeared on the curved horizon, he was not the lightest of moods. He barely attended as Tsukumo rattled off another list of misnatos, this time of all the things that were considered rude and antisocial in Suna culture. The thumbs-up gesture means something else here, so don't use it under any circumstances. Don't point at people, don't show people the soles of your feet, don't do anything I don't do, refer to men with their surnames and women with their given names, and don't ever turn your back on the Kazekage when in his presence. Do you remember the Suna bow? Yes, Sakumo-sensei, Minato sighed. Absolutely do not forget it. The way into the village was through a passage that cut between some very tall, very crooked cliffs, and at the entrance of this passage a small delegation of elders were waiting for them. They wore smiles like they had 2 electrodes attached to their cheeks, and the effect was quite alarming, but while their unfriendly leers may have ghosted over him, it was Tsukumo they fixed their sights on. "Welcome to Suna. We are honored to be graced with the presence of Konoha's most celebrated White Fang and Yellow Flash. Please won't you come this way? Like two hapless sheep being led into an abattoir, Minato and Tsukumo entered. If there was one impression Minato knew at once he would take home from Suna, it was sand. Sand on the ground, sand in the air, sand on the walls, between the stones, in the hair and inside the shoes. Against all reason, the people here wore more clothes than those in the cooler climate of Konoha. Almost everyone wore floor-length robes with white scarves wrapped loosely around their necks and shoulders like a shawl, and there was just something a little harder about these people. Konoha was filled with civilians and ninja who brightened every street with their vibrancy and diversity. In Suna, not only were they all dressed alike, Minato didn't think he ever once saw anyone smile, beyond the plastic expressions of their team of escorts. Perhaps the people of Suna were perfectly jolly, it was just that they were wary of strangers. As they crossed the dusty, winding streets, people were prone to stop and stare at them as they passed in a way that would have been extremely rude back home. Was curious ogling the norm here? It seemed that most of them were looking at Tsukumo, and this could have been because they recognized him, or because the man was quite a formidable figure. If he inspired any intimidation amongst the Suna citizens, Minato knew how they felt. They were shown at once to their rooms in a palatial hotel and informed, with the utmost politeness and discretion, that they were not to leave until someone came for them. Then the doors were shut on their conjoined rooms, and the unmistakable sound of keys turning in locks echoed through the chambers. Are we supposed to be made to feel like prisoners of war? Minato wondered. I'm sure they would say it's for our own safety, Tsukumo said, throwing his backpack down on his bed. The war between Konoha and Suna was especially bitter. There are probably many people in this village with a grudge who would love an opportunity to take out two Konoha nin. Everyone seems to know who you are, Minato said, unpacking his own bags. You must have been pretty famous here during the war too. The door between his and Tsukumo's room slammed shut, killing the conversation stone dead. Minato sighed and wandered around the edges of his room, examining his new accommodations. The writing desk was a nice touch, and the window had a spectacular view over the rooftops of the village, which was like looking out on a field of termite mounds. And naturally in the course of his inspections he dismantled all the listening devices in his complimentary cactus and various light fittings, and stuffed some toilet paper from the en-suite bathroom into the hole in the wall where a spy camera was filming. After a quick shower to remove the grime of 3 days of travel in the desert, Minato settled down on his bed and picked up a rather prominently placed copy of a book entitled The Grand and Proud History of the Great Nation of the Wind. Well, if nothing else it was a good bedtime story, and before Minato knew it he was coming round to the sound of loud knocking on his door, his book having fallen on the floor long ago. The woman standing out in the hall shook her head emphatically at him when he opened the door. No, 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 this won't do, she declared, long dark hair shimmying as she took in his short-sleeved shirt and cut-off pants. You'll need to dress warmer than that, I'm afraid. Minato had no idea who the hell she was, but she was clearly mad. This is the desert, he protested. Yes, and it gets extremely cold at night, and since we're going out you'll need something warm to wear. She bustled past him and went to a chest of drawers that Minato had yet to open. Where are we going? He asked her. You and Hatake Tsukumo have been invited at the Kazekage's pleasure to attend the festival of puppets, she explained, flapping out some clothing she'd found. Here. This will do. That's not mine, Minato pointed out. If you wish to learn about Suna culture, first you must wear our clothes, she told him patiently. He looked at the shapeless outfit which looked curiously like a dress. Brown isn't my color, he said. Giving him a hard look, the woman replaced the robe and withdrew another set. Perhaps you'd prefer lavender? Oh, sure. Lavender brought out his eyes. Please hurry and change, I will be waiting for you outside. The woman bowed and started for the door again. Minato quickly remembered to ask her, who are you exactly? My name is Rumiko and I will be your guide and escort throughout your stay here in Suna. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask for either myself or my husband, Rui, who is waiting on your friend next door. Minato scoffed. He's really not my friend, he said. No? Rumiko's smile twitched a little wider, perhaps a little more genuine. Then you will get along just fine here. As she shut the door to give him privacy once more, Minato wondered just what that meant. He turned to the mirror and wiggled into his new dress, and spent several minutes doing his best to wrap the scarf around his shoulders the way he'd seen on the natives. Eventually, satisfied he'd done his best, he stepped out into the hall. Rumiko was indeed waiting for him, as was Tsukumo and a tall red-haired man Minato assumed was Rui, the husband. If he'd also attempted to convince Tsukumo to wear local clothing, he'd failed. Tsukumo was dressed in the same fatigues he'd arrived in, obviously taking issue with the immerse oneself in local custom suggestion in the pamphlet, and the look Tsukumo gave him was one that said Minato had once again managed to sink even lower in his estimation. If we're all ready, Rumiko said pleasantly. What is this festival? Minato asked her. The Festival of the Puppets? It's a time-honored tradition of ours, and we're glad you arrived in time to witness it. Rumiko told him. Puppetry is one of Suna's oldest crafts, not just for entertainment, but in warfare. It has become our trademark of sorts. Yes, I think I've heard of Suna's puppeteers, Minato confessed. He'd never crossed blades with anyone from this village, so their methods were mostly alien to him. They certainly did their part in the war, Tsukumo said darkly, hiding in holes and pulling strings from a distance so they never had to face the people they killed. Rumiko smiled at him with disconcerting amusement. Surely you don't intend to accuse our people of cowardice, she said. While I'm sure in Konoha, nobility and honor precede everything including wisdom, in Suna we are not afraid to maximize our defenses in any way possible. Our puppeteers are the reason our village still stands after waves of barbaric attacks. Konoha would do well to adopt similar strategies. Oh, Minato was really beginning to miss home. He at least hoped Tsukumo was done and wouldn't rise to the bait, and sure enough the other jonin stayed quiet for the rest of the trek through the streets while Rumiko talked almost non-stop about the village, the importance of the landmarks they passed, and the history of the festival they were heading to. Are you a puppeteer? Minato asked politely, when she paused a moment to take a breath. No, she said. Although Rui is rather good, and our son is prodigious. You should see him taking part of the display tonight. I look forward to it. Minato said, and caught the withering look Tsukumo shot him. The festival was taking place in a square that was far larger than anything in Konoha. Crowds were packed around the edges of the plateau upon tiered benches, all their attention on the procession of performers circling like a trapped snake before the spectators. Every few seconds a paper lantern was lit and rose from the crowd to soar into the air, and when Minato looked up it was like the night sky was full of blazing orange stars. He was keen to dive in and try out some of those strange honey-glazed pears, or bribe someone into letting him have a go of one of the strange wooden marionettes that every third child seemed to be playing with. Rumiko had other ideas, however, and she marched them past the jovial crowds to a staircase leading up to an open terrace. 2 seats were waiting for them beside a man in the unmistakable robes of a Hokage. Kazaka Jessima. Rumiko bowed and scraped her way to his side. The ninja from Konoha are here. Face consumed by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat, the Kazakage acknowledged their presence by raising one elegant hand, never once turning in their direction. They were not so much honored guests perhaps, as they were a mild irritants to be endured, but at least the Kazakage didn't glare at them the way the red-headed man behind him did. He couldn't have been much older than Minato, though he stood like an elite jonin and was evidently some kind of right-hand man to the Kazakage, and every angle of his posture warned of hostility towards the pair from Konoha. Minato decided to avoid that one. How is the old monkey? The Kazakage said, his voice low and measured. It was easy to see this voice belonged to one of the strongest, most ingenious shinobi in the world. Not that Minato understood him. Sorry? Sarutobi. He's not so bad, Minato said politely, trying to contain his horror at such a nickname. The Third World War would break out if it got back to Konoha that the Kazekage called the Hokage an old monkey. You must be the Yellow Flash, the Kazekage went on. We're heard a lot about you. You're the one who killed General Akuz? Minato shifted uncomfortably on his hard, flat, sandy seat. Yes. That man was a thorn in our side during the war. It amuses me he fell to a brat with a girl's face. Without pausing to enjoy that Minato's mouth had literally dropped open, the Kazekage swiftly turned his attention to Tsukumo. White Fang. How is your dear wife? A muscle in Tsukumo's jaw twitched. As you know, Kazekage-sama, she is dead. Yes, of course. And by Masa's own hand, wasn't it? The leader of the Sand Village gestured to the angry young man beside him, who glared daggers right back at them. Dear God, what kind of hell had they walked into? Had the Hokage realized he was sending Hatake Tsukumo off to play nice with the people who had killed his wife? If the knives started flying, Minato was going to be right in the middle of it, and now he rather regretted taking this seat between Tsukumo and the Kazekage, the latter of whom was not finished winding everyone up. Masa really should be thanking you, White Fang, as it was this triumph that made him my successor. If the rumors of you are true, Yellow Flash, one day you will be the fourth Hokage, and at that time perhaps Masa will be the fourth Kazekage. Minato and Masa glanced at each other, and right then Minato strongly suspected there would never be peace between their two villages. Ever. The phenomenally tense silence that followed was broken when Rumiko suddenly leant forward to put a hand on Minato's shoulder. There he is, she said excitedly, pointing to a small figure in the festival procession who had to be controlling 3 life-sized puppets with absolute mastery. There's our boy. Go Sasori. When the key turned in the lock, caging him in, Minato at once began to stride around his room, dismantling all the bugging devices that had been reset in their absence, and the moment he was done hanging a towel over the new camera hidden in a bowl of ornamental baubles, he strode right though to Tsukumo's room to see him doing the same. This, he said emphatically, was a big mistake. Didn't you enjoy the festival? Tsukumo asked dryly. Not when I was sandwiched between the killing intent of you and that lunatic who's going to be the next Kazekage. Minato cried. Why would the Hokage send you back here? Your presence here is far from peaceful. Tsukumo shrugged out of his vest and laid it carefully on the bed. We can't all be schmoozers. You shouldn't be here, Minato said. We'll make some excuses and get you sent home tomorrow, because there's no way. Are you telling me what to do? Tsukumo turned to him sharply, using his most icy, penetrating stare that had terrified Minato as a child. Who do you think you are? Minato thumbed his forehead protector. I'm a jonin, the same as you, he said, more bravely than he felt. Neither of us can pull rank here, so let's not get into that. But even you can see we have a major problem on our hands. You're emotionally compromised. We're here on a mission of peace, and you're trading barbs with the Kazekage on the first day. And as for yourself? Tsukumo asked coolly. I seem to recall him saying you had a girl's face. Minato colored. There's nothing wrong with having a girl's face. Indeed, half the human race managed to get by with such a handicap. And you're avoiding the issue. Stop worrying about our purpose here, Tsukumo told him, turning away to shake sand out of his sleeves. This is a holiday for you, isn't it? Just sit back, enjoy the sights, suck up to whoever you like, and continue milking the success from that day you got lucky with Akuz. You do what you do best and everyone will be too in love with you to worry about what I'm doing. That raised Minato's eyebrows. And what are you doing? Let's just say we're here for different reasons. Meaning? Minato demanded. You're here to soothe war wounds and make allies. I'm here to make sure Suna is in no position to wage another attack. Oh, so we couldn't pass up the opportunity for free espionage? The Hokage still could have sent anyone for that reason, like someone without personal grudges against this village. Tsukumo gave him another look that would have made him wet his new lavender robes had he still been a genin. I am very good at my job, he said slowly, and you would be hard-pressed to find someone in Konoha who does not have a reason to hate Suna. Now turn in. You have a long week of romancing the enemy ahead of you. Thus, Minato was banished back to his room. He was quite sure that later he heard or saw something outside his window that may have been Tsukumo leaving for some reconnaissance, or may have been a Suna agent keeping a close watch since he insisted on removing all their surveillance devices. Whatever it was, Minato refused to concern himself. He went to bed, only to end up tossing and turning for several hours. Unfamiliar bed had that effect on him, and he wasn't used to the intense dryness of the air that made his skin itch and crack. His concerns did the rest to keep his brain whirring like a loose box of live wires. It seemed so cynical to send someone like Hatake Tsukumo on a mission of peace for the purpose of espionage and possibly even sabotage. Minato knew he himself had only been selected to counteract such a man. His reputation as a compromiser who drew people to him the way honey drew flies was going to make him a popular choice of ambassador. He disliked being used as a cover, however, especially being kept ignorant of that fact. Minato pulled the pillow over his head and longed of home. Just a few more days, he promised himself, then he could go home, back to his own room and his own bed where there wasn't a speck of sand to be seen. Back to Kushina, who would have gotten over whatever depressive fit she was in, and would be there waiting for him with a smile. If he was lucky, she would have baked him a cake to celebrate his return. If he was really lucky, she would have broken up with Run. The itinerary for the next few days was dizzying. Rumiko led him with all the ferocity of a drill instructor through all the must-see sights of Suna. The first stop was a museum of warfare, where the grand history of the village was illustrated in gory detail. Then she took him to a restaurant to try out the local delicacy of desert hare and brown rice, which was spicy enough to make his eyes water, much to the good-natured delight of everyone who watched him, which was, needless to say, everyone in the restaurant. Minato attracted stares wherever he went, and gradually he felt people were becoming less guarded around him. It possibly helped that Tsukumo stayed behind at the hotel, claiming to have caught a stomach bug from the strange and possibly tainted foreign food. It was offensive and entirely untrue. Minato had no doubt Tsukumo was off skulking around the village unescorted while everyone assumed he was laid up in bed. At one point Minato was taken to some kind of training yard to observe some of Suna's finest while they sparred. It was blatant boastfulness of Suna's part. They wanted him to be impressed by the caliber of their fighters, and to be fair, Minato was quite pleasantly surprised even if he wasn't blown away. When he was invited to join in, he had to decline. He was under strict orders not to demonstrate any of his own skills to Suna. If he were to lose in a sparring match, it would be Konoha's disgrace, and if he were to win, it would be Suna's. Better to just politely shake his head and claim to be too tired. Rumiko insisted on showing him the nightlife too. Suna, she said, had a very young and lively population. The majority of inhabitants were under 20, and at night things could get very active. This turned out to mostly be shadow puppet theater. Suna's youth had rather sedate tastes compared to that of Konoha, Minato decided, thinking back to people like Yamanaka Inoichi, whose idea of a fun night was getting drunk and sticking certain appendages through the letterboxes of houses belonging to girls he liked. By the third day, they were beginning to run out of sites to visit. While Tsukumo continued to beg off sick, Minato was taken around administrative offices which were, frankly, more like a palace carved out of sandstone than an office. He wasn't permitted to see how the Kazekage's office compared to the Hokage's, but he was shown the parts open to visitors, including the hall dedicated to honoring the two former Kazekage. Their statues rose up proudly to the domed ceiling, but it wasn't quite the statement that Konoha's mountains made. Rumiko acknowledged this. But I find a monument that dominates its village so much a little tasteless, don't you? The last place she took him before releasing him to explore at his leisure, providing he didn't notice the spies tracking him, was a strange building at the edge of the village. It stood like a crooked tower against the brown cliffs that enclosed Suna, and was guarded by what Minato guessed were the Wind Country's equivalent of Anbu. This, said Rumiko proudly, is where we keep the Jinchuriki. Minato did a double take. Pardon? Shikaku, the one-tailed beast. His host resides here. Minato looked carefully at the building. A real Jinchuriki? Can I see him? Rumiko laughed. Oh, no. Shikaku is very dangerous, it wouldn't be wise. But I've never seen a Jinchuriki before, Minato said, and it was one of the few times in his life that he consciously and quite deliberately tried to charm the socks off someone. He gave Rumiko his most winsome grin, like he was nothing more than a curious boy with a mischievous streak rather than an elite enemy jonin with a thirst to uncover one of Suna's most closely guarded secrets. Please, Rumiko. She shook her head, looking regretful. Access is very restricted. She said. I won't tell anyone here, he promised. Just a little peek. Please. We have nothing like this back in Konoha. Everyone will be so jealous when I go home and tell them I got to see the one-tailed beast. Appealing to her sense of nationalistic pride did the trick, and Rumiko caved with an indulgent laugh. Just a quick look, she agreed. She must have had pretty high clearance as the guards let her pass without a word. Paradoxically, the interior of the tower was hollowed out like an upturned ice cream cone, and the real entrance of Shikaku's residence was a trapdoor. Anticipation mounted in Minato as Rumiko guided him through a small labyrinth of narrow underground passages that would have made someone as tall as Tsukumo duck in order to pass through them. They descended further and further until the tunnel came to an abrupt end, opening into a chamber that rivaled the size of the hall honoring the Kazekage. There were more guards here, stationed around the edges of the room, but as far as Minato was concerned, it was empty. The wide floor was covered in sand, more than he would have considered normal for an underground lair, but that was all. He looked at Rumiko, about to ask her what the deal was, when he noticed she was looking up. Minato followed her gaze and stiffened. Suspended from the ceiling by cords of steel was a body. Like a puppet it was hung, contorted and tangled, wrapped in bandages and shackles. Archaic seals of binding covered his form and the cables looped around his limbs and chest. These were the heftiest fortifications Minato had ever seen, for what essentially looked like a corpse. Is that? Minato breathed, unease tingling up his spine. Shikaku's host, Rumiko explained, just as quietly. She didn't appear to find this sight as creepy as him. He looks pretty human, Minato observed. He'd expected him to at least have the tail these beasts were so famous for. Is he alive? Rumiko nodded. Oh, yes. Then he's sleeping? Oh, no, said Rumiko, now shaking her head. He never sleeps. He never, ever sleeps. Minato looked back at the dangling figure with greater apprehension. It was easier to imagine he was dead or unconscious than awake and listening to them. Shikaku has a special place in Suna's legends, Rumiko began, switching into her tour guide mode. It's said that he is the discontented spirit of an old monk who was sealed into a kettle. The man who released him became the first Jinchuriki, and when one host dies he takes possession of a new one. Like all the tailed beasts he has a malicious disposition. Hosts are almost always driven insane, the force of such evil inside one, constantly whispering and screaming into the void, that's why they never sleep. You can give them all the sedatives in the world to calm them, but they will never sleep. This one was captured many years ago. He put up a great fight, but we've learned much from observing him. The Kazekage developed his feared iron sand technique after studying him. Above them, the suspended host twitched. You talk like he's an animal, Minato said. Rumiko glanced at him, surprised. That's what they are. They may look human but their natures are wild. You underestimate them at your own peril. If this one wasn't contained, he would level the village in a moment. Minato's curiosity to see a Jinchuriki was utterly sated. In fact, he sort of wished he hadn't witnessed this, and his lack of awe left Rumiko a little disgruntled. When they parted ways, Minato headed straight back to the hotel instead of exploring the rest of the village. Tsukumo was there, looking remarkably hale for a man who professed to be so violently sick. You know they have a Jinchuriki here, was the first thing Minato said to him, once he'd completed his debugging ritual. Underground. Big vault. Lots of guards. Tsukumo, seated in a chair by the window, looked up from his book. You saw him? Clear as day. They're not too concerned about keeping it a secret either. Why would they be? Almost every village has or had a tailed beast in their possession. Konoha doesn't have a Jinchuriki, Minato pointed out. Tsukumo gave him a flat look. Huh, he scoffed. Most have escaped and gone wild again, there aren't many Jinchuriki left at this point. If the villages can't control them, they're more likely to be hunted and killed. Minato sighed, flopping down on Tsukumo's bed to test if it was softer than his. Perhaps that's for the best. Excuse me? Tsukumo scowled at him impressively. Seems like you're better off dead than living as a monster. I know I'd rather die than be turned into a freak like that, he said. Tsukumo's book closed with a snap. Minato looked around in surprise to see the other man crossing straight to the door. Where are you going? He asked, bemused. Out, snapped Tsukumo. I may be some time. They'll have you followed, Minato warned him. Then I'll enjoy much better company than here, he said, and before roundly slamming the door behind him he honored Minato with a glare he hadn't seen the likes of since the last man who had tried to kill him, and you had to be in the doghouse if Hitaki Tsukumo preferred the company of Suna spies to yourself. That was worse than usual. Tsukumo had always held mild contempt for him, but this time Minato felt the hot sting of outright hate. Minato wandered back to his room, not sure what he'd said this time to offend him so much. It was the dead of night when Minato awoke. As the first eerie wail of the siren rose over the village, he was already sitting up before he understood what had woken him. By the second tone he'd reached the window, hyper-alert, and scoured the moonlit rooftops for some sign of trouble. There were people moving out there, and a lot of them at that, but there was no way to tell from up there what was going on. An attack? A drill? A sandstorm? Had the Jinchuriki escaped? Minato turned and began to jam his clothes on, intending to go out into the corridor and question whoever was standing guard, and there was always someone standing guard. The door may have been locked but that meant nothing to Minato. One quick lock-breaking jutsu and he stepped out just in time to see the guard crumple against the wall with a groan. Tsukumo calmly folded the white saber for which he was named out of sight, stepping back to avoid the spreading pool of blood. He looked over at Minato who was gaping at him from the doorway of his room. I think it's time we leave. Big. Understatement. Did you just kill him? Minato demanded. Put on your Suna clothes and pack as much water as you can, Tsukumo ordered. Leave everything else, it'll be dead weight in the desert. Minato didn't move. What have you done? I don't have time to explain. Just do as I say or we die. There was no reason to think he was exaggerating, not with the siren penetrating through the walls, so without another word Minato whirled and began to raid his drawers. He was no less furious with Tsukumo, even as he obeyed. He pulled on the Suna robes and ran to fill his flask with water from the bathroom, and though he paused a moment to take what scrolls and weapons he needed, he left the rest of his belongings behind. As he ran to join Tsukumo in the other room, he couldn't shake the sense that he'd forgotten something important, though he'd brought nothing of value to begin with. In his room, Tsukumo had finally consented to dragging on Suna clothing of his own, and only out of desperation. "You ready?" he asked, slinging his backpack over his shoulders. When Minato nodded, they went straight to the window, opened it as far as they could, and dropped down into the rocky garden below. Their descent didn't go unnoticed, and shouts rose up from the tops of the buildings nearby. Tsukumo shoved him, urging him to move, and Minato ran full out, pounding the sandy streets as he dived between houses and zigzagged through the alleys. He didn't pause to make sure Tsukumo was keeping up, concentrating only on shaking whatever possible tail they'd picked up. The moment he saw an open second-story window, he ran at the wall and scrambled through it, landing silently at the foot of a sleeping child's crib. Over the thundering of his own heart he heard people moving about in the house below, reacting to the siren. As long as the child didn't wake and start crying, this was a safe point to stop and strategize. Tsukumo dropped into the room a moment later, and together they hunched out of sight beneath the window ledge. Conscious of the sleeping infant just feet away, his parents downstairs, and the gangs of ninja searching the streets for them outside, Minato tempered his tone. "Now will you tell me what is going on?" Tsukumo brushed off the question with one of his own. "This jutsu of yours, Hiration," he said, "what kind of range does it have? Can you transport yourself out of here?" "I can only transport between tags," Minato answered. "I laid one on a rock before we entered the desert, just in case we got lost and ran out of water. I could probably make contact with it. But it's at my limit." "Can you transport 2 people?" Tsukumo demanded, glancing at the infant who had made a noise in his sleep. "I've never tried it. If you're asking me to transport us out of here, we should be so lucky. Crossing a whole desert by myself is one thing. Together, we'd have to be a lot closer to the tag, and even then I'm not sure it would work." "How much closer?" "Like a day closer?" Tsukumo sighed irritably. "You couldn't have placed one nearer the village?" "I'm sorry, I didn't anticipate that we would be fleeing for our lives," Minato shot back. "And this is all just academic. I'm not transporting anyone or anything until you tell me what's going on." Tsukumo held a finger to his lips, warning him to remain quiet. "The Kazekage has gone," he whispered. "Gone where?" Minato asked, blinking. "They don't know. He's just gone. They can't find him, so naturally they suspect foul play. But that has nothing to do with us. Why are we running if we didn't do anything?" Minato asked, when a terrible thought occurred to him. "We didn't do anything, right? Sakumo-sensei?" The older Jonin rolled his eyes. "I wish I could claim credit for disappearing that old tyrant, but no. This has nothing to do with me. If I planned to kill anyone around here first it would be Masa." Minato frowned. "So we're running because that's what innocent people do?" "It doesn't matter if we're innocent or not," Tsukumo interrupted. "They're looking for someone to blame, and the first place they'll look is to us. If you don't want to be killed or trapped here for the next couple of years as a political prisoner, we need to get out now. Hopefully they'll sort this out amongst themselves, but this is not the place to be for a couple of outsiders right now." Heaving a sigh, Tsukumo lifted himself up onto one knee to peer over the windowsill, scanning the skyline. "We're going to need all the luck we can get just to escape. There's no point heading for the gates, we'll have to scale the cliffs and hope for the best." "Luck?" Minato echoed, eyes wide. "Yes, luck," Tsukumo agreed impatiently. "Although I won't stop you if you want to transport out of here alone. It's just as easy for me to escape the village by myself as with backup. There's no point endangering you as well, or heaven knows if Kushina would ever forgive me if something happened to you." Minato, however, wasn't listening. He rose to his feet and began to climb back through the window before Tsukumo's hand on his elbow stopped him. "What are you doing?" the older Jonin demanded. I have to go back to the hotel, Minato said. I forgot something. Whatever it is, it's as good as gone. Forget about it, you don't understand. I can't leave unless I get it. Minato reached out to pat Tsukumo's shoulder, impressing a Hiraition tag onto his sleeve. Don't wait for me. I'll join you as soon as I have it. Oblivious to Tsukumo's protestations, Minato dropped to the street again and began retracing his steps with care. Every shadow could have concealed a Suna shinobi, and a whole team of them could be waiting around every corner. When he heard footsteps he dove for the nearest doorway and masked his presence with a genjutsu, and there remained perfectly still until the nin had run past his position without any one of them glancing in his direction. The hotel was too exposed to risk entering through the window the way they had escaped it, and Minato sought the staff entrance. The lock on the door was already broken. He suspected this may have been the same route Tsukumo had used, and indeed, as he made his way through the corridors to the elevator he found he was following a path of destruction. Unconscious cleaners, a trail of blood from someone who had managed to escape with his life. And more than one dead body. It was eerily quiet as Minato rode up the elevator to his floor. No one would think either of the two escapees was stupid enough to return here at this point, and there was no one to see Minato as he stepped over the guard felled by Tsukumo and into his room. Mere minutes had passed since he's dived from the window, but someone had already ransacked the room, looking for him or looking for clues. He hurried to the nightstand to open its drawer, worried that his item might have been seized as evidence of some kind. But no. The only one who saw the value of this badly beaten-up necklace was himself. Minato stuffed it into his pocket with a sigh of relief. That was when the door slammed shut behind him. A little foolish of you to return, Minato-kun, said Rumiko. As she stepped towards him he saw that the encompassing robes had been pushed back over her shoulders to reveal the uniform of Suna's ninja. She was no mere tour guide. I didn't come here to cause trouble. I was just collecting some of my things. And now that I have them, I'll be on my way if it's all the same to you, he said. Rumiko's husband, Rui, strode in through the connecting door to Tsukumo's room. You're not going anywhere until you tell us where your friend is. He's really not my friend, Minato protested. Then you won't mind helping us out? Rumiko smiled at him as she had when she'd showed him the Jinchuriki's suffering. Hatake Tsukumo is a sworn enemy of Suna and we were fools to trust Konoha's motives in sending him here. Tell us what he has done with the Kazekage and our son and we'll let you go. We have no quarrel with you. Your son is missing too? Taking the Kazekage was one thing, but who would take the child of two unknown nin? Like them? Konoha may not think twice before killing children, but to us our children are precious. Surely you understand? Our son is an innocent, I'm afraid I don't know where he is, lied Minato, as if he didn't have a tag on his compatriot that let him know with uncanny accuracy exactly where he was right at that very moment. Then, said Rui, we'll just have to take you instead. No, Minato said stolidly. Don't be difficult, Rumiko chided him like a mother. You're outnumbered and for all your titles you're still just a boy. It would be unfortunate if we had to relay our deepest regrets to Konoha that their little yellow star had expired due to some unfortunate accident when he resisted arrest. The look he gave her was reproachful. I thought we were friends, he said sadly. And she shook her head at him as if he really was a child who knew nothing. Konoha and Suna will never be friends. Minato leapt for the window at exactly the same moment Rui lifted his hands. Hair-thin wires of chakra snapped taut across the room, as sharp as razor blades, and Minato had to change course midair to avoid being sliced to ribbons. Behind him, the bed lurched. More threads had seized it and as Rui swept his arms to the side, it lifted clear of the floor and slammed against the window, blocking any escape. Someone like him could turn every object in the room into a weapon or an obstacle, even Minato himself if those threads latched onto him. He remained on the floor, quite still. There was every chance that if he moved, his head would be sliced off. "Come quietly, Minato-kun," warned Rumiko, stalking towards him as she unsheathed a ninjato from under her robe. "No one needs to be hurt." "I agree," said Minato. "Just tell us where Hatake Tsukumo is. Tell us what he did with our Sasori and the Kazekage, and we can all work together on this." Minato carefully weighed his options and his odds. However he looked at it, this wasn't going to end well. "You want to know where Tsukumo is?" he said with a sigh. "Look behind you." Rumiko and Rui spun, raising their weapons to defend themselves. Against nothing. The half-second it took them to realize their deception was all the time Minato needed. Hiration was activated, and the next thing he knew, he was colliding with another solid body on some distant rooftop. Tsukumo hissed a curse and swung his saber out reflexively. Minato ducked and just about managed to avoid being bisected by his own ally. He chose to believe it was accidental. Tsukumo couldn't have hated him that much. "A little warning would be nice," Tsukumo grunted. "Not for a faster-than-light transportation jutsu," Minato remarked. Tsukumo had almost reached the cliff face when Minato had joined him. The high rock walls that formed a protective shell around the village was the most uneven here, providing the greatest shadows and nooks to pass unseen. It also looked like the most difficult section to climb. Summoning chakra to their feet and hands, they took to the smooth wall of solidified sand and began to climb. They had barely made it halfway when they were spotted. Minato glanced over his shoulder to see bright pink flares sailing into the air, billowing light and smoke. Every shadow that had protected them was banished. Their pursuers had caught up to them and the assault was instantaneous. A deafening string of crashes rocked the cliff wall, threatening to dislodge them. Above them, rocks began to cascade, dislodged by explosions thrown from below. "Get behind me!" Tsukumo shouted, and Minato swung below him as the other Jonin swiped his saber and released an arc of lightning to cut through the worst of the falling debris. The rocks still pelted them, splitting skin and bruising bones, but they clung to the cliff for dear life. Minato was the one who saw the hail of Senbon cutting through the smoke of the flares, heading right for them. A deflective wind jutsu knocked them away harmlessly, though no sooner had they fallen than another wave bore down on them. "Keep climbing," he yelled to Tsukumo, "I'll keep them off us." It was tricky, letting go off the cliff with his hands and channeling more chakra to his feet until he was standing horizontally, all the while summoning his elemental chakra between raised fists until the air circled between them. The wind moved faster and faster, becoming a vortex that whipped Minato's hair and clothes and scattered the flares into darkness. The Senbon rained down on him but were lost in this whirlpool of air to be flung violently away. Beneath his wall of air, Minato began to move, climbing upwards once more. He caught up to Tsukumo at the brow of the cliff, and the moment they were over the lip and onto solid ground again, Minato released his jutsu with a whoosh. He could have done with a rest, but Tsukumo tugged his sleeve insistently. "Keep going," he said. "You're doing well." It had to be the nicest thing Tsukumo had ever said to him, and it rejuvenated him for at least 10 more miles. They set off over the rocky ridges of Suna's best topographical defenses, heading directly east for the border of the Fire Country. They only had to get closer to Minato's tag at the edge of the desert. He could already feel it, a distant, indistinct tingle on the edge of his awareness. He could activate it immediately if he chose, but that would mean leaving Tsukumo behind to a very angry village that had been dying for his blood since the moment he'd arrived. More deafening bangs threatened to overturn the balance of the world. The solid rock beneath their feet tipped and began to break up, as ninja in the wind-forged passages below ruthlessly tried to collapse their escape route. Minato and Tsukumo quickly leapt clear of the cavian and forged on through the explosions that followed. It seemed like their attackers were closing in. They may have been 2 of Konoha's most elite jonin, but they were still only 2 against a whole village. Minato thought desperately. They needed a better plan than simply running away. "We need to find a place to lie low," shouted Tsukumo, over the crash of detonations. They were running through a constant shower of shrapnel and dust. "Follow me and get ready to mask your chakra." Minato kept close on his heels, and when the dead tree next to them exploded in a brutal spray of wood chips, Tsukumo suddenly changed direction and dropped down a gap in the cliffs. Minato followed. It was like falling into pitch darkness, and at the point when he expected to meet the ground he just kept falling. A loud splash in an icy stream ended his descent, and Minato might have inhaled a fair bit of the water in his surprise. Tsukumo hauled him upright and flattened him against a wall that was almost as cold and wet as the floor, smothering his coughs with his hand. Had they just found Suna's famed aqueducts? A warning might have been nice, he thought, and would have happily told Tsukumo so if he hadn't been effectively gagged. Far above them the explosions continued, but they seemed to be getting further away. Whatever bomb-happy pursuer had been after them had not noticed their sudden stop. After a moment, Tsukumo eased back and rummaged in his backpack for a torch. He immediately shone it straight in Minato's face, of course. "Now are you going to tell me what was so damn important that you had to risk going back for it?" he demanded, hiding behind the intense light like a true interrogator. "Did you leave your precious stuffed anteater?" Minato ground his teeth together, incensed at Kushina's apparent betrayal. If she was going to tell her teacher about all his embarrassing secrets, she could at least relay them accurately. "He's a precious stuffed elephant, actually," retorted Minato, "and I don't bring him on missions with me." "Small mercies," deadpanned Tsukumo. Knocking the torch aside, Minato pushed away from the wall of the tunnel. "What's our next move?" he said, changing the subject. "How far do these aqueducts extend beyond the village boundaries?" "Miles," said Tsukumo. "They have their traps and security measures, but they'll be easier to navigate than being chased down by half the village above ground. We need to stay here for a while, though. Let them chase their own shadows for a while before we press on and risk alerting them to our position again." That seemed reasonable, so Minato found the driest lump of rock available and sat down. Trapped in a close, cold tunnel with Kushina's unforgiving teacher wasn't going to be fun, but it was rather more fun than being blown up, so somehow Minato would find the will to cope. He kept his eyes on the beam of the torchlight as it scanned the rippling surface of the water, the bare walls of their surroundings, and peered up and down the length of the water passage. It kept returning to flash over Minato like a prison watcher's searchlight sought out a prisoner. He felt Tsukumo viewed him in roughly equal terms. "An heirloom from your mother," Tsukumo suddenly said. "What?" Minato squinted at him. The other jonin turned the torch towards the ceiling, where the light reflected off the shiny rocks and trickled down around them with more ambience. They could both dimly see each other now. "You wouldn't have left any top-secret scrolls or weapons lying about since we weren't allowed to bring any. You seem to have no sentimental attachment to any of your common weapons that would make you go back for one in particular. You're not particularly literate, so I don't see you going to rescue a book. You're not much into fashion, so it's unlikely you left behind any clothes you couldn't bear to part with, and from what I've seen, you always keep your money on you, so that wouldn't explain it either. Whatever it was you fetched, it was no doubt useless except in sentimental value. Since you didn't care for your father, it must be from your mother." A shudder and a low boom rocked their passage. Apparently Suna hoped to scare them out like frightened mice if they made enough noise. Minato waited until the rumbling thunder of the distant explosion faded away before answering. "If it was, I don't see how it would be any of your business." "Just curious," shrugged Tsukumo, "but why bring something so valuable anyway?" "I bring it on all my missions. It gives me luck," Minato said squarely. "And if luck fails me, I'd rather die with it than without it." Tsukumo stroked his chin. "Interesting. Can I see it?" Childishly, Minato thought about refusing him. He didn't like being poked and prodded in such a sensitive place, but Tsukumo might just bother him more if he became uncooperative. He reached into his pocket and tossed the necklace over to the other jonin, who caught it deftly and held it in the light of the torch. The broken thong was badly frayed, but though the disc dangling off it was chipped and dirty, it glittered like a smooth seashell. Tsukumo stared at it, perplexed. "I've seen this before," he said, "but this isn't your mother's." "I don't have anything left of my mother's," Minato explained. "That's from Kushina. She gave it to me." "When?" "Years ago. Before we left for the war. It's a symbol of the Whirlpool Village." "I can see that." Tsukumo passed it back, now looking at Minato with an expression he hadn't seen before. "That must have been 5 or 6 years ago. You really take it on every single mission?" "Why not?" Minato responded defensively. Most ninja had their little curios of luck and fortune. People tended to be quite superstitious in their line of work, though he realized his was a little lame. "I was wearing it when I defeated Accuse, and I'm not dead yet. I must be pretty lucky." "Or perhaps you can thank some of your own ability too," said Tsukumo, which was surprisingly generous coming from a man who had previously dismissed his triumph over Accuse as a matter of mere luck. Minato was so surprised he didn't know how to respond. "For a while." "Does Kushina know you still have it?" Tsukumo asked. Minato lifted a half-hearted shoulder. "Maybe." She acted innocent, but he knew she went through his things too from time to time, and she may have seen it hidden away in his desk drawer. "You should tell her," Tsukumo said. "She would probably like knowing you value it so much." Minato shook his head with certainty. "Nah. She'd call me a sappy idiot." "Yes, but she'd be happy." Tsukumo knew his student well enough to know she was good as disguising her pleasure with displeasure. "Maybe," he repeated, tucking Kushina's necklace away with a smile. He honestly preferred to keep it as a memento from the dirty, awkward girl who had said goodbye to him at the village gates while making him the fierce promise that they would always stay best friends. If he brought it up with the new Kushina, she might just devastate him by mentioning she had given one to Ren too. "You really have nothing of your mother's?" Tsukumo continued. "My father destroyed most of her things when she died," he replied, something he had never felt strongly about. "I think he was trying to destroy memories of her." Tsukumo shook his head. "They weren't his memories to destroy," he sighed. "It doesn't really matter. Would you say that if I destroyed everything of my wife's so Kakashi would never know his mother? You wouldn't though, because unlike my father you actually like your son and you wouldn't dream of doing it." The back of Minato's head hit the cold, hard wall with a weary thump. "There's no point getting angry or hurt about it. What is done is done. My mother betrayed her husband, and what he destroyed can't be brought back, so why care? Because you don't care about enough, particularly when it comes to other people. You care about that necklace, which means you care about Kushina, and that gives me hope. But you should care about the injustices against you, or why on earth would you care about the injustices against anyone else? And how could you become Hokage?" Minato scowled at him through the aqueduct's gloom. "Right. I should give more to charity if I want to be Hokage," he said, with a bite of sarcasm in his tone. "You'll be Hokage one day," said Tsukumo nonchalantly. "For better or worse." "Huh," grunted Minato, unconvinced. While there were people like Orochimaru in the village, and Ran, and Tsukumo, and Jiraiya, Minato didn't think he stood out as particularly favored. In a fair fight any one of them might kick his ass, and the Hokage had to be the strongest. "And if you're looking for memories of your mother, maybe the best place to look is to you father," Tsukumo went on. "You're a real one." "That's nice," Minato said, patience wearing thin, "but I don't know who he is." "Yes, but Namikaze Midoriko's secrets aren't mine to divulge, and all I have are rumors anyway, so what I think may be wrong. All I know is that you should go to the academy and look for classroom 2B. You might find the answer there, or you might not. It's your journey to make either way." "My journey?" You sound like a fortune cookie. Minato could almost laugh. You're pulling my leg about the academy, right? You won't know until you go. You are messing with me. Minato refused to believe otherwise. Tsukumo flicked the torch up until his face was lit from beneath. We'll see, won't we? Minato never got the chance to respond. At that very moment something struck him so hard that he was sent sprawling into the freezing water all over again. He heard someone shout, "They're here," and a rough arm grabbed his. Had they activated a summoning trap? Had followed them down the crevice? The importance of such questions swirled away, and Minato knew only that they'd been caught and now it was a right for their very lives. The hand that pulled him up broke with a snap as Minato rammed him against the wall. Bodies jostled against his and torchlights swung confusingly, lighting everything and revealing nothing. A knife sliced past him, barely missing his chest. Minato helped guide it into the belly of an attacker, as smooth as butter. For every blow he landed he planted a tag. Like smoke he slipped between their greedy, grasping fingers and took them out before they even realized he had vanished. Someone got lucky and grabbed his neck. That one was quickly thrown into the water, and the Rasengan that followed him lit the passage like a tiny blue sun before being swallowed by a blast of water that sent flying the rest of the Suna dogs snapping at his heels. In that tiny reprieve he sought out Tsukumo, worried Kushina's teacher had been taken by surprise as well. The man in question would have been contemptuous of such a concern. He was slashing through enemies with even more disregard than Minato, using the body of one man as a shield of flesh against one opponent while he fenced with another, his charged white saber flashing in the dark as if it were apart from its wielder. When the cool, slim edge of a blade kissed Minato's throat, he froze. Inching his head around, he saw Rumiko standing beside him. "I don't want to kill you, but I will if I have to," she hissed close to his ear. "So let me say this just one last time, where is my son?" Minato said nothing. He couldn't help her, and anything he said in his own defense would be seen as a lie. He waited, watching the desperation unravel across her face as she realized he would never help her. Whether he was guilty or innocent now didn't matter, she would kill him out of pure pain and anger. The very second the muscles in her arms tensed, about to force her sword through his yielding neck, Minato vanished. But Rumiko was cleverer than his other opponents. She had watched him fight from afar and witnessed how he appeared to jump from place to place, defying all laws of time and space. At once she spun and slashed at the body. Minato had left his last tag upon pain sliced across his shoulder. He bit down on the cry of pain and wheeled back as warm blood spread through the cold, sodden fabric of his shirt and robe, thinking only to gain distance. Rumiko raised her arms once more, ready to strike him down. The choking cry of a man to her right made her stop. Minato couldn't think why, in a passage filled with agonized moans and screams of death, this one would bother her, until her face drained of its angry color. "Rui!" she screamed, loud enough to bring silence crashing down on their heads. Rui, clutching his open throat, fell to his knees at Tsukumo's feet. All the corpses he had utilized as puppets fell with him, their strings literally and figuratively cut. "Rui, no!" Rumiko abandoned Minato, hurtling toward Tsukumo's back with her sword raised. And Tsukumo made it look too easy. At the last moment when it looked like Rumiko would have him, he turned and caught her. The saber slid between her ribs, ending her cries. All Minato saw was the shining tip protruding from her back, before she too collapsed into the steam, reaching towards her lover and husband as she shuddered and died. There were still opponents left, but even they were left momentarily stunned by such short, violent deaths. In a moment they would continue the fight their comrades had started, and after them even more would come. Knowing time was short, Minato turned upstream, east, and lifted a tagged kunai from its holster. He threw it into the darkness, as far and hard as he could, and before it had so much as landed, Minato turned and ran at Tsukumo. The older Jonin had begun to reset his stance, anticipating another wave of attacks from the men and women just feet away. He did not quite expect to be tackled from behind by Minato. Nor did he expect Minato to activate Hiration at that very moment and yank them both of them 600 yards in less than an eye blink. The impact hit Minato almost as hard as Tsukumo. They landed in water and pitch darkness, disorientated and winded. "What was that?" gasped Tsukumo. "Hiration," Minato panted, "I wanted to see if it worked with two people. This isn't really the time to be experimenting with jutsu, but I appreciate it," Tsukumo said, getting to his feet. Downstream, their pursuers with their lights realized what they had done and began to give chase. There was no time to enjoy this new revelation, and Minato quickly scooped up the tagged kunai. He looped his arm through Tsukumo's, ignoring the searing sting of his injury, and urged him into a run. "Just keep up with me," he called. As they ran at full speed, Minato threw his tag ahead of them. Before it descended, he activated the jutsu, whipping them forward another few hundred yards to catch the blade before it landed. Then he threw it again, relying on the precise straight lines of the aqueduct to keep the momentum going. Tsukumo stumbled at first, making noises about travel sickness and being far too old for such energetic things, but he quickly got the hang of it. In moments the sounds of their pursuers faded into the distance, falling so far behind them that even their lights disappeared. When the kunai hit a solid wall with a thunk, they knew they had reached the end of the aqueduct and escaped upwards through a vent to the surface. The moon and the stars greeted them from above like dear old friends, and desert surrounded them on all sides. Far to the west they could see the shape of Suna's cliffs jutting against the sky. Minato was rather grateful to see it looking so distant and small, and together with Tsukumo he allowed himself a moment to slump and attempt to catch his breath. Tsukumo just looked at him, astonished. "I had no idea," he panted, "that you could do something like that." Minato shook his head. "Neither did I. That was the first time I've ever done that." Tsukumo stared him like one of them might have been mad, though he wasn't sure which. "You're a monster," he said at last. "Oh," said Minato uncertainly. "Thanks." Shaking his head, Tsukumo shot the sky a baffled look. "I'll let you train Kakashi," he said earnestly, "as long as you promise never to put me through anything like that again." They arrived back in Konoha 3 days later on far better terms than they had left. Dirty, tired and dusty, Minato hoped to go home and crawl into a bath, but the guards at the gate, of which there appeared to be an unusually large number, told the pair that a Category 2 state of emergency had been declared and they were to report immediately to the Hokage. Somehow the news of Suna must have outpaced them. It was only natural that the disappearance of the Kazekage would result in extremely heightened tensions between villages, and they were no doubt being summoned to the Hokage to explain how a mission of peace had gone so badly wrong. In his office, the Hokage was waiting with his nephew, Run. There were no smiles or friendly greetings when they entered, and Minato was certain Ren's jaw even tightened when they laid eyes on each other. Then the Hokage, after taking in their bedraggled appearance and blood-splattered clothes, spoke some truly baffling words. "You're back early. Did something happen?" Tsukumo coughed, perhaps thinking this was a joke. "Nothing untoward, Hokage-sama. Only," Minato added conscientiously, "the Kazekage has gone missing, we have been blamed, and we had to kill a large number of Suna's people just to escape." "It went as well as could be expected," Tsukumo explained with all seriousness. The Hokage was speechless. He looked between them, waiting for the punch-line, until he eventually realized it wasn't forthcoming. His weary face fell into his hands. "This is the last thing I need. Of all times. Why now? This will almost certainly mean war," Ren mumbled, looking pained. "Isn't that why a state of emergency has been called?" Minato pointed out. "That?" The Hokage scowled impatiently. "That has nothing to do with it. The threat of Suna is entirely news to me, and while I can't say I'm pleased by it, I'm sure you did everything you could. Then what other reason is there for a Category 2 emergency? Tsukumo asked curiously. It seemed like a sensible question. Category 2 emergencies weren't declared for anything short of a possible invasion or a natural disaster, and if the Hokage had been oblivious to the unfolding events in Suna until this very moment, what could be so dire enough to threaten the village? Forcing a sigh, the Hokage tented his fingers and looked unhappily between his guests. I declared the emergency yesterday, he explained heavily, because Uzumaki Kushina has escaped the village and as of right now her location is unknown to us. As unstable and dangerous as she is, we are all in significant danger the village hasn't faced for over 50 years. His declaration was met with stunned silence. A flash of devastation and dismay may have briefly contorted Tsukumo's face before he mastered his emotions again, accepting the weight of the news with a bowed head. Minato just blinked. Wait. What? Uzumaki Kushina? Yeah, I've not seen her in a while. Is it true she bailed without authorization after all this stuff with Suna and the Kazekage kicked off? You know when people do that, it usually means they're up to no good. Chuza. It's Uzumaki. She's a pacifist. All the more suspicious. He's right, you know. It's suspicious. What if she's only a pacifist when it comes to fighting for our side? I mean, she was always pretty adamant that this wasn't her village, and considering she's quick to rough up anyone around here who offends her, or is caught in an innocent misunderstanding, she was awfully timid about fighting the waterfall forces because she said some of them were her people. If anyone was going to turn traitor, it was her. Inoichi. What, Shikaku? Shikaku looked pointedly at Minato, who stood staring at them like a pale thundercloud. The Ino Shikacho trio could practically see the electricity jumping through the air around him like a crackling aura. Suddenly Inoichi didn't seem quite so convinced of Kushina's disloyalty. Or, you know, she's shy. Easy to mistake for treachery. When Minato spoke, it was with the cold, flat tone that preceded a killing spree. Thank you, you've been extremely helpful. And he left them at the entrance of the training grounds and continued on his way to the Hokage Tower. They'd told him to go home and get a wholesome night's rest, but that was a little much to ask after the bombshell that had been dropped on his head. And how was he supposed to sleep soundly in a house whose emptiness howled, never allowing him to forget that there was someone important was missing? How was he supposed in a bed that, like everything else in the house, had been overturned in his absence by zealous ANBU agents who probably had no idea what they were looking for or if there was anything to find? Minato hadn't been able to stay long. He couldn't bear to see all the things Kushina had worked so hard for, and cared for with such meticulous pride, scattered on the floor, bent, broken, and smashed by hands who didn't know or care about their worth. The only one who had escaped molestation was the single remaining guinea pig in the pen outside. Oblivious to the calamity that had befallen his caretaker, the little rodent was busily grazing when Minato went out to check on him. Kushina had evidently made no arrangements for someone to care for him. She'd told no one she was leaving. In fact, she appeared to have left most of her things. Perhaps that was why Ren was convinced she'd been kidnapped. Kushina has very special chakra, he had said in the Hokage's office when Minato and Tsukumo returned from Suna. The village has done its best to protect that fact, but it's possible one of our enemies has learned how valuable she is and taken her. The Hokage was willing to entertain that possibility, which was why he had permitted Ren to mount a rescue mission with eyes on Kyumo. Usually when people of extraordinary abilities were abducted, Kyumo Nin were behind it, and they apparently specialized in taking people with Kushina's chakra. But what's so special about Kushina's chakra? Minato had asked. He'd never noticed anything strange about her abilities. He knew her nature was wind, like his, and that even as a young genin she'd shown she could inject a tremendous amount of energy into her techniques, which he had always put down to a lack of control. It was slightly unusual, but not so strange that he would expect any village would covet her. And the Hokage had looked at him with deep regret. You're not cleared to know much more than that we must pull together and find this girl, as much for our safety as for hers. Minato had wondered if he was dreaming, if he had collapsed in the desert beneath the baking sun, was hallucinating that he'd returned to Konoha and the Hokage telling him Kushina was a village secret. But it had been too lucid and stark to be conjured by his severely limited imagination, so then he'd suspected it was a practical joke the Hokage had decided to play to lighten the terrible news that they may soon be back at war with Suna. And yet Ren looked even more cheerless than usual in Minato's presence, and Tsukumo, who couldn't possibly be in on the joke, looked like he had received the news that an aged companion had died, as tragic as it was expected. It was no joke, and so Minato had refused to take the Hokage's delicate snub with a bow and a "thank you," as he was expected. Kushina was his friend, and if she was mixed up in something terrible he felt he had the right to know. He said as much to the Hokage, more forcefully than was probably permitted in the Hokage's presence, and he ignored Tsukumo's warning cough and the severe expression on Ren's face that told him he was edging onto thinner ice. But the Hokage was not offended by his insubordination. "You are a relatively new jonin," the Hokage said, all too compassionately. "There are things about this village and the secrets it contains that may not be made known to you for years. I will tell you all you need to know, that we must find your friend and return her to the village as discreetly as possible. While she remains at large there can only be danger." "Then you're not talking about Kushina," Minato said bluntly, clenching his fists at his sides. He was willing to admit that she was a menace when armed with an umbrella, but this was pure slander. Nothing she had ever done had given him or anyone else reason to be cautious of her. "You have no right to call her unstable and dangerous. You don't even know her." "My uncle knows her far better than you do, Minato-kun," interjected Ren. "As do I." Minato had never wanted to hit anyone else as hard as he wanted to hit Ren at that moment. The Hokage had brushed his bristling nephew's defensiveness aside. "You're right, of course," he said to Minato. "Kushina herself is a young woman of immense fortitude and kindness, and there are many in this village who would do better to look to her as an example. She's governed by strong morals which she refused to relinquish during the ugliest moments of war, at great risk to herself and without regard for what others thought or said of her, and I have no hesitation in saying that my nephew is the better for having known her. She has come a long way since she arrived as a refugee. I would trust her as I would trust a daughter, as I trust Ren's judgment as I would trust one of my sons." Minato did not at all care for such casual suggestions that Kushina might as well have been part of their family, mostly out of dread that it was true. "Then why slander her?" he demanded. "Because Kushina holds the key to something else that is far bigger and more terrible than you and I can fathom. It is not her fault, and I don't think her capable of malice, but she could hurt a lot of people with the burden she carries without ever intending to. Not only that, but above all she is in danger of hurting herself. While she was part of this village she was protected. I fear she does not know what she does by leaving. Unless she was taken against her will, then we are all in even greater danger," Ren added. Minato ignored him. "This isn't possible. Are you telling me that Kushina is carrying information? A village secret?" "I cannot say any more than that," said the Hokage sadly, lifting the stately hat from his head to place it on the desk before him. Like this, he seemed more like a man than the formidable leader whose face was carved into a mountain, a legacy that would span countless generations or more. "You already know too much, Minato." Minato looked between Tsukumo's solemn acceptance of everything the Hokage had said and Ren's expression that warred between genuine grief and a smudge of smug haughtiness that here at last was something Minato could not share with his girlfriend, as they shared everything else. "Why me?" he asked petulantly. "Everyone else seems to know around here." "Tsukumo knows because as her teacher it was necessary. Ren was only made aware of it recently by accident, against my wishes." I do not try to keep the truth from you because I feel you can't be trusted with it, I do it for Kushina's sake. I only tell you this much because it's imperative we find her and that you understand the gravity of the situation. Any more than that, I think you would find it to your detriment. Here, the Hokage looked at Ren, who had begun to look more and more uncomfortable as his uncle spoke. My detriment? Minato could not believe what he was hearing. There is nothing you could tell me about Kushina that would ever hurt me or my opinion of her. There isn't a truth in this world that would change my feelings. The Hokage smiled a little, although his nephew could not raise his eyes from the floor. For a moment Minato thought he had won, until Tsukumo put a hand on his shoulder. Let Kushina have her secrets, he said. It's not for you to demand them. And so Minato had stepped back, once more reminded of his place. Since then a hollow ringing in his ears had accompanied him wherever he went, like some fundamental truth about the universe had been shaken loose and everything he thought he knew had turned out to be wrong. What could he trust now? Ren was going on a mission to Kyumo, under the belief that Kushina would never have left the village by herself, despite knowing of her earlier threats. The Hokage wanted Minato to join one of the tracker Nin teams that were being sent out, but as of yet, he resisted. Tracker Nin hunted renegades. When they found them, they brought them back in chains and bonds if they didn't outright kill them, and Minato could not stomach the idea of hunting someone he loved. He wandered the village in a state of semi-shock. Security was on high alert and no one he met really understood why. Most assumed it was due to the political upheaval in Suna, and if they knew or cared about Kushina's disappearance they thought it was only coincidental. In truth, Minato felt just as uncertain and confused as they did. He kept on asking whoever he met about Kushina, hoping for some clue or sign that there really was something about her that he had missed so completely. In the markets he examined the flower stall that Kushina had visited so diligently as if it would reveal her mysteries to him. The flower girl that Inoichi was keen on recognized him and pointed out Kushina's favorite flowers, thinking he had come to collect them for her. He went away with a handful of multicolored lupins that left him none the wiser. He already knew she liked lupins. Mikoto came across him by the fountain in the very center of the market plaza. She approached with a basket of fish and vegetables, clearly attending to her wifely duties, and looked at the bunch of flowers drooping in his hands. You look like you've been stood up, she observed without a smile. She knew that Kushina was gone, for she was the one who had reported it. She left the village, Minato said morosely, running his fingers from the small, closed buds at the tip of the stems to the fat bell-shaped flower heads beneath them. She left her house. She left her guinea pig. She left all the fresh flowers she bought and all the things she earned from working her way up from nothing. She left her teacher and Kakashi and Ren. She left you. And you, Mikoto reminded him. Minato was painfully aware of that already. I thought she was just in a funny mood. I didn't really think she'd do it. Beside him, Mikoto sank onto the stone lip of the fountain. Kushina can be awfully strong-minded. Once she sets her mind to something she'll accomplish it. If she wanted to leave the village, she would do it sooner rather than later. You couldn't have stopped her, so don't blame yourself, Minato. If I'd been here, Minato sighed, maybe I could have said something, but she promised she would wait until I returned. I thought I could have gone with her if she really had her mind set about going there. Mikoto turned to look at him sharply. You know where she's gone? He nodded and pressed the lupins to his nose, even though there was no scent. It would have been better if she was into lilies or roses, so that he could have been reminded of her every time he inhaled their fragrant aroma. I thought she only had a short visit in mind. Mikoto's hand suddenly seized his arm. The basket of vegetables was in danger of slipping off her knee. Minato, she said urgently as he blinked at her in surprise. If you know where Kushina's gone, you have to tell them. Everyone's looking for her. They're worried sick. Yes, he agreed, unmoved by her fierce grip. But from what they've said, I'm wondering if Kushina had a very good reason to leave. I wonder if she was actually escaping. Escaping from what? He shrugged, struggling to understand a situation that people refused to explain to him. All he knew was that he trusted Kushina and her judgment. If she had left and had gone to lengths to do so in secrecy, he had to believe she knew what she was doing, regardless of the flattering condescension the Hokage showered on her, talking about her as if she was nothing more than a naive child. Minato, Kushina could be in real trouble, Mikoto insisted. Where did she go? He could have told her about all their arguments, and how Kushina had insisted that she needed to return to a village that simply wasn't there anymore, and how all her connections here were just shackles holding her back. Well, it seemed she'd finally cast them all aside, like all the people who loved her truly were nothing more than dead weights. Yes, she could be in trouble out there on her own, but it seemed like she would be in enough trouble if the village caught up to her, and he knew that. If he told Mikoto, she would inform the Hokage, believing she had Kushina's best interests at heart. When he said nothing, Mikoto rose to her feet and glared down at him. Have it your way, she said coldly. But if something happens to her, it'll be your fault. Don't let love blind you into thinking she can't make mistakes when she's hurting. At the word love, Minato felt a hot prickle break out over his skin. He wasn't ashamed, but to hear his feelings spoken about so bluntly when he had never spoken them aloud was a shock. Many people had joked that he and Kushina were a couple, but none of them truly believed it, and Mikoto's eye was far sharper than theirs, her opinions more valuable. Of course she would have noticed his doting on Kushina went beyond merely platonic feelings, and her sly, secretive smiles when he was talking about their mutual friend had always been a little too knowing. He hoped on the graves of all his unknown ancestors that she had not shared her suspicions with Kushina herself. Right now Mikoto offered him no knowing smiles. His unrequited love didn't amuse her, not when she thought it was clouding his judgment. If you don't want to tell anyone where she's gone, you'll have to go get her yourself, she said shortly. Her normally docile nature had given way to something much forceful in her anger. Don't you dare mope around here like she abandoned you personally. Kushina didn't leave you, she left her whole life. She is not thinking clearly. You don't understand, was his muted response. He was willing to concede, at least to himself, that he was taking her departure a little personally, but there was more going on here than a few injured feelings. Mikoto looked like she was just as much in the dark as he was about whatever burden it was Kushina was carrying that made her such a danger that the village had declared a state of emergency. What is there to understand? She asked. Kushina has gone. You know where she is. If you insist on keeping that knowledge to yourself, then you will be the one who has to bring her back. What else needs to be said? She did make it sound quite simple. After that Mikoto left him to mull over his words, saying it was almost dinner time and she had a slave driver of a mother-in-law who expected her back on time to feed her husband. Needless to say, the next morning, when Ren set off to the Lightning Country to search for his beloved in the mountains, Minato convinced the Hokage to let him lead his own search party of one to the eastern shores where a small island lay off the coast. Since the war it had been known as the Wave Country. But before then it had gone by a very different name. The first time Minato saw a whirlpool was when he was 18, crossing the strait between the Fire Country and the Wave Country in what felt like the smallest, most unreliable boat ever built by human hands. Kushina had told him about them, but she had neglected to mention that they were apparently deadly. Perhaps she, like the fisherman who had kindly offered to ferry him across free of charge, was simply so used to them that they took this in their stride. Lose a lot of people in these waters, the man said, pummeling the sweeping waves with his oars. One hit the bow, sending the boat shooting 6 feet into the air, and while Minato may have turned green and clung onto his seat for dear life, the man just laughed. We get so many whirlpools here because this is where the North Ocean meets the East Ocean, and when they have different tide levels the waters just churn. Isn't it magnificent? We didn't call it the Whirlpool Country for nothing. Is it ever calm? Minato asked, fighting down rising nausea. Never, the fisherman called back to him cheerfully. The trick is to predict ere the whirlpools will appear. If one opens up right beneath you, you get sucked in and that'll be the end of you. Minato witnessed one such vortex appear in the waves just a few meters to their right. For a horrible moment the back end of the tiny boat started to drift towards that swirling black hole in the violent waters. In the next moment the strong arms of the fisherman won out and they began to move forward again. You should build a bridge, Minato advised him, once he'd recovered his voice. Yeah, we'll get right on that. Never before had Minato been so glad to feel solid ground beneath his feet again. When they reached the tiny dock, the fisherman thought he was so ill that he was invited to sit down on the flattest patch of grass they could find while his wife offered him a flask of warm fish soup that was supposed to settle his stomach. Your first time to the island, huh? The fisherman patted his back sympathetically. You're a ninja but you're not one of the whirlpoolers, are you? They come back sometimes. But they come less and less these days. There's not much here for them. Minato looked about the port. Small as it was, it bore the old signs of war and dilapidation. There were no ninjas here, just civilians who made their living off the fish. Has a girl with red hair come by recently? Minato inquired queasily. You're the first visitor I've seen in years, said the fisherman. If Kushina had returned here she must have chosen another route as no one else had seen her either. Are there any other settlements on the island? Any other people? There used to be the ninja village, of course. And this port used to be bigger before it was raised. Every who could, fled. We're it, I'm afraid. All you'll find past here are ruins. Despite the warnings, Minato thanked the man for his help and his wife for the fishy broth and then he set off inland, following a brick road that had almost disappeared beneath the encroaching growth of unchecked grass and vegetation. This was, they assured him, the road to Uzumaki, the village hidden in the whirlpool tides, which was one of the most apt names ever given to a hidden village since those whirlpools did a lot to deter all but the most determined travelers. The broken road led him through the hills and around the mountainous peak at the center of the island. Landslides seemed to be a problem in this subtropical corner of paradise. Many times Minato emerged from the thick cover of trees to find the remains of the road ahead lying at the bottom of a deep gully or buried completely beneath a new hill, making it impossible for anyone but a ninja to pick his way across the obstacles to continue on. He knew he was getting close when he picked up a post from a bed of ivy. It had been worn almost faceless but he could still make out the markings of the whirlpool symbol, the same design as the necklace Kushina had given him all those years ago. It was just a little taste of the kind of destruction he would find further up the road, as there was certainly nothing else in these tranquil forests that hinted at the kind of slaughter that had taken place here 10 years ago. The lilt of birdsong could disarm him, and when the salty breeze came off the ocean to stir the gentle treetops it was hard to imagine a more peaceful place. When Minato came across the first ruin he almost missed it. What first looked to him like a mass of vines and discarded driftwood was, on closer inspection, all that remained of a house. What could be salvaged had been taken, possibly by the fishermen at the port to rebuild their town, and all that was left was the skeleton of foundations that had become as much a part of the forest as the forest had become part of it. There were more further up the road, and soon the remains flanked him on all sides like line upon line of graves. Once this may have been an avenue of homes, winding through the forest towards the famous village, and if Minato closed his eyes he could almost imagine them rising up around him. Back in the academy there had been textbooks on the other ninja villages, and he remembered the chapter on the Whirlpool village well even before it had fallen, though mostly what he remembered were the pictures. It had been a distinctive village, surrounded by hills and bisected by an immense river spanned by gleaming red bridges. Minato reached the end of his road and looked down the hillside to the village below. 10 years. And it was like the war had only ended yesterday. The remains of chaos and destruction spread for miles. Buildings tumbled into each other. Broken, Faded red poles jutted out of the river like bare ribs, all that remained of the grand bridges that had captured Minato's attention in his school books. Black scorches engulfed huge stretches of debris where forgotten fires must have once raged, and dead, cracking trees forbid the surrounding greenery from intruding. Perhaps the forest wouldn't dare reclaim land that was so tainted with bloodshed and ghosts? And perhaps that went for the other inhabitants of the island too, for while the houses on the road may have been picked clean by vultures and left to be consumed by nature, the village itself must have lain untouched for a decade. Looking upon it was like looking at a fresh battlefield. Was Kushina really down there? Minato was not religious or even very spiritually observant, but he may have offered a small prayer to all the souls that had been lost here as he descended the road into the village, hoping they wouldn't mind him disturbing their resting place. The streets were silent, except for the salty breeze that whistled through buildings like air through broken teeth. He was surprised at how the strong smell of charred wood and metal clung to the village, even to this day, though the last fire must have been put out by the rain years ago. Over there was all that was left of a tea house, its dusty sign just about all that had survived intact. Then there was another building that remained miraculously standing, despite the entirety of the ground floor having been blown out. It rocked in the breeze, propped up only by the remains of the buildings to either side of it. There was nothing that didn't bear the marks of destruction, and what hadn't been destroyed had been defaced by vandals. That was perhaps what churned Minato's stomach the most. It was one thing to see the natural ravages of a war. Another to come to an old monument at a crossroads and see the engraved face of the village's founder smeared with red paint and insults. The graffiti was everywhere, signed by the same word over and over again. Reformists. Reformists. We take this village and make it our own, they claimed. Yet where were they now, he wondered. Overwhelmed with the idea of rebuilding this monstrosity from scratch, had they simply fled to the other villages, posing as refugees? Were they proud of themselves? A flash of red caught his eye, and jerked his gaze down one long avenue where he could have sworn he saw someone with red hair just disappear over the shell of a fallen tower. Kushina, he blurted, and hurried down the avenue after her. As he scrambled up onto the remains of the tower, he paused and looked around from his vantage point, wondering which way she might have gone. He'd found the edge of the village, and from here she had either turned down a path of rubble and blackened timber, or she had gone straight ahead, past the village boundaries to unruly fields of wild grass and flowers. Something about Kushina told him she would always follow the flowers. Minato jogged on, and sure enough it wasn't long before he spotted a figure some distance away, seated at the base of a large, grass-covered mound. There was no mistaking that glorious sheet of tomatoed hair that cascaded down her back to pool on the ground. As far as he could see she was only sitting there, facing the mound, and it was one among many, all as perfectly square as the next one. He'd seen enough war to know what mass graves looked like. At this safe distance, Minato stopped dead. Everything the Hokage had said rolled through his mind like a clap of thunder. Unstable. Dangerous. She could hurt a lot of people. Without ever intending to. Something else that is far bigger and more terrible than you and I can fathom. And as Minato watched her, he saw her lift her hand and twiddle her finger in her ear before bringing it away to examine her findings. He suddenly laughed. What an idiot, he told himself. I can't believe I nearly bought all that crap. Like a terrific weight had been lifted off his shoulders, Minato started forward. He was too relieved to see her to be bothered by the thought of Konoha's state of emergency and all the teams of Trackernin scouring the country for this temperamental redhead. As he approached, he slipped his backpack off his shoulder and reached inside to withdraw the carefully wrapped package he'd brought all the way from Konoha. He'd intended to give them to Kushina, but now he knew there was a better use for them. So, although they were slightly crushed and wilted, when Minato came to stand beside Kushina, he placed the lupins on the ground next to the wild flowers she had gathered. It was a meager offering to her mother, and all the other faceless and nameless people who rested here, but it was all he had. He sat down beside his friend and smiled at her wide-eyed stare of astonishment. "Do you know how much trouble you're in?" he asked her, aiming for exasperation, but he knew he sounded too pleased to see her. "I count that 2 ANBU divisions and a rescue mission to another village to recover one girl because she forgot to tell anyone where she was going." "What's that about?" Kushina muttered, ducking her head. "Beats me." He shrugged, deciding it was not worth discussing. "Not yet. You were supposed to wait for me." "I got tired of waiting," she said. "And you would only have tried to stop me. Or maybe I would have come with you." "Would you have really wanted to come here?" she asked incredulously. That was a question easily answered. "I'm here, aren't I?" He turned to look at the mound before them. Up close he could see that each grave was marked with a number of stakes, upon which were marked names and symbols. This was possibly the work of the whirlpoolers who occasionally returned, looking for family members they'd lost. The newest marker bore the unintelligible scribble of Kushina's handwriting, and all he could make out was the surname Uzumaki. "Is this where your mother lies?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I remember it clearly. Second from the end. Unless they added more pits after I left, in which case she's over there somewhere. I don't suppose it really matters." He vividly remembered the time she had told him her own Haitayat had been reclaimed out of one of these pits, and how she had crawled for days through stinking bodies to find her mother when she couldn't have been much older than 8. She had brought it with her now. He could see the white ribbon stark in her hair and the silver plate covering her forehead, flashing in the light as he lifted her head and stared into space. Was she remembering that time? "It seems like there's a lot of bad memories in this place," he said, looking over his shoulder at the crushed remnants on the village. "Yes," Kushina said fairly, "but there are good memories too. This was where I was born and raised. This was the field I played in with my friends, and this at least hasn't changed much. Do you see that cherry tree?" Minato looked at the proud, green tree in the middle of the meadow. "Sure. That was our climbing tree. You can still see the rope we used to swing from. I fell off once and cut my leg really deeply on a stone." She lifted her right leg to show him a pale white scar on her calf. A very shapely calf. "I cried like such a baby. Why isn't Ren with you?" It took Minato a second to realize she'd changed the subject fast enough to give him whiplash. "Ren? He thought you'd been kidnapped or something. He's, on his way to Kumo." "Oh. Good." Without explaining what she meant by that remark, she rose to her feet and dusted the grass off her backside. "Do you want to see my house?" She might have been any other girl, asking him back for dinner to meet her family or see her collection of pets. Except he'd seen her village. He knew there wasn't a house left standing. Sure." Evidently pleased, she offered him her hand and pulled him to his feet. "This way." She led him back through the jungle of smashed buildings and crossed the river. They pressed up a slope and passed the debris of a grand spire that Kushina said had been their equivalent of a Hokage tower. "My dad worked there," she said blithely. When she finally pointed out her house, Minato was surprised. Back in its day it must have been large and detached with an expansive garden, and even though now most of the upper floors were now spread across the walled yard, it was clear to see that Kushina had come from a far more affluent family than he'd realized. Still, when Kushina threw her shoulder against her own front door and knocked it down, he held back. "Is that really safe?" he worried. "Nope," she replied, pulling him inside. The house within had been stripped of its furnishings and gutted by fire. Minato stood on the threshold staggered at how utterly ruined it was, noting how part of the collapsed roof could be seen on the staircase, and the entire back wall was simply missing. "The reformists did this?" he asked her. "Yes." Kushina crossed the barren floor of what could have been her old living room to examine a badly burnt painting that, against all odds, remained hanging on the wall. This was one of the first places they attacked when they started. They were pretty thorough. Minato stared about him. Isn't there anything left? Anything of value would have been scavenged by the people in the port town. When he made a derisive sound, Kushina glanced back at him. The way I see it, if we left it behind they were entitled to it. The war hit them pretty hard too. Besides, if it was anything of real value, whirlpoolers had methods of hiding things so thoroughly no one would ever find them. What do you mean? Kushina lifted the painting off the wall and turned it over in her hands. The back came off easily, revealing the blank side of the canvas within. She lifted it out and brushed her hand over it. At once an inky swirl of pattern emerged, reacting to her chakra. After a moment's hesitation, like a musician who hadn't touched her instrument in years and wasn't sure of the right notes, she pressed her fingers against certain points of the pattern and turned her hand, like turning a handle. The pattern disappeared, and upon the canvas now sat a heavy bag of coins. Sealing jutsu is our specialty, she explained. These seals are impossible to break unless you know the exact sealing method used and the combination of seals. My mother hid our money all over the house when the trouble started, but I guess most of the seals were destroyed by fires. Not that it matters much, whirlpool money isn't worth the metal it's stamped on these days. She tossed the bag of coins to the ground like a clod of dirt and went to investigate some debris in the corner of the room. She was much more interested in the charred remains of an old cassette tape, and a lump she swore was her old stuffed rabbit. I've heard a bit about whirlpool's sealing jutsu, he said, as he obligingly helped her lift a floorboard so she could root around for an old pencil case she used to hide down there. Is it true you can seal people? Yes, said Kushina. In the most advanced forms, we could seal people into objects, and objects into people. And chakra. You can seal someone's chakra into another person. My mother told me of a technique where you can bargain with the god of death to seal people's souls if you're willing to pay the price, though I think that one could just be a myth. Incredible, he murmured. Is there a size limit? Like, could you seal a mountain into a mouse? Kushina sat back on her heels, looking decidedly uncomfortable. She hadn't found her pencil case, but she had found a marble. Maybe. I don't know much about it, she said, looking oddly at the glass ball rolling around her palm. It was the only thing in this house unscathed by fire. It's a lost art. It died with the village. That's a shame, he said. She shrugged. Maybe it's better off lost. Why? It's your village's legacy. She shrugged again, more stiffly now, and tucked the marble into her pocket as she rose. There isn't anything left for me here, she said. Would you like to see my most favorite place in the world? There was that sense of whiplash again. Sure. We'll have to be quick, before the light fades. She grabbed his hand to get him moving again, out the broken door and down the hill again, past a sloping row of shops, whose glass fronts were red with graffiti. Down by the river a little boat was waiting for them with all Kushina's supplies stashed inside the hull. This must have been how she'd gotten to the island, and why the port people had never seen her. You must have taken the long way around the island, he said. Well, yeah, she responded. Only an idiot takes the whirlpools head on. Minato suddenly felt cold and stupid. Well, yeah. She took one oar as he took another, and after a little muddling he worked out the rhythm that came so naturally to his friend. Living on an island in a village divided by a great river, she must have spent plenty of time on the water, and soon they were surging along, helped by a strong current heading out to sea. The village's desolation rolled past them, and even though Minato had seen pictures of this place at the height of its glory, it was getting more difficult to imagine the mountains of rubble and bricks had once been a bustling civilization. They were leaving it behind now, heading towards the open sea. At the river mouth stood 4 towering statues to welcome travelers entering by boat, or guard against trespassers. Minato looked up with interest as they rode between them, taking note of the names engraved on plaques at the feet of each figure. Are those your village leaders? He asked. Kushina looked at them blankly. Yes. The third was headless, but the plaque at his feet made Minato point. That one was called Uzumaki too. Is that a common name for whirlpoolers? Her blank look switched to him. Yes, she said flatly. But he was also my father. Minato looked back at the statue more closely. At least this explained why he worked in the administration building. So. Where's his head? Kushina shrugged as if she didn't care. She had never mentioned her father before today, let alone the fact that he'd been the leader of her village. That was usually something people would boast about endlessly, but right now Kushina looked like she wished he hadn't brought it up. She had turned her attention to the wide bay they were now drifting into, and after a moment of looking about and gathering her bearings, she pointed to a distant slab of rock thrusting up through the water with one sad-looking tree growing on it. Over there, she said. We can moor the boat there. What's over there? He asked. One bit of ocean looked just like the next as far as Minato was concerned. You'll see. She smiled at him and doubled down with her oar, forcing him to keep up or see their boat start turning in circles. The moment the hull bumped snugly against the rock, Kushina jumped up to loop a length of rope over one of the tree's branches. Then, to Minato's mingling horror and delight, she began to take off her clothes. What are you doing? He stammered as she battled to drag her blue tunic up and over her head to reveal she wore a black sports bra underneath. They'll just get wet. You better take them off. Too, she said. After a mere moment's hesitation, Minato's scrambling hands began tearing at his clothes, not bothering to ask for a reason. His green vest hit the deck, followed by his black jersey and protective mesh undershirt. His shoes nearly went overboard in his rush, and as soon as his pants drooped around his ankles, Kushina coughed. Why, you can leave those on, she said quickly, pointing to his boxers. Likewise, she had decided to keep on her own underwear, both pieces of which were rather large and sensible, and completely mismatched. Other girls might have been self-conscious, standing semi-naked before a boy in the open air, but Kushina was more concerned about the pattern on Minato's boxers. Cherries? She asked quietly. What's wrong with cherries? These were his most comfortable pair and that was all that mattered. This was not a subject Kushina was willing to push too hard, and so she shook her head. Have you ever gone diving before? She asked him. Not deliberately, he admitted. As long as you can swim. She grinned at him and beckoned him with a finger. Come on. I'll show you the best place in the world. Kushina suddenly hopped over the side of the boat and dropped into the water with hardly a splash. After a second she surfaced and wiped water from her face. Come on. Sharks, he thought. Killer jellyfish with tentacles half a mile long. Squid that could shoot up out of the black depths to swallow a man whole. He'd never willfully dived into water he couldn't simply walk over, and Inoichi had made him watch a special on sea monsters only a few weeks ago, which had left a more lasting impression on him than he'd realized. However, he had to trust Kushina to know what she was doing, and who would know these waters better than someone who had lived here half her life? Taking a deep breath, Minato stepped off the boat and plunged into the cool, salty water. When he surfaced, his eyes were squeezed firmly shut. He heard Kushina laugh at him. You'll have to open your eyes or you won't see anything, she chided him. How long can you hold your breath? Until I start drowning, he answered truthfully. Then follow me. Kushina slipped beneath the surface and Minato did the same, forcing his eyes open when every instinct told him it would sting like crazy. It didn't. Through the crystal-clear water he could see Kushina propelling herself downward with the powerful strokes of an experienced swimmer, and Minato followed suit. There were other movements down here, he noticed. Not sharks or eels or squids, but fish. Shoals of little silver things flickered like coins as they changed direction and scattered. Bigger yellow ones floated more sedately around the rocks that moored their boat. Minato had never seen anything like it. Ahead of him Kushina stopped and anchored herself to the rocks with a hand. Her head turned to look at him and her hair fanned out in an incredible wave around her. She might as well have been a mermaid. Right then the air very nearly left Minato's lungs in a rush, and only by a masterful force of will did he keep control of himself and accept the hand she held out to him to pull him closer. She was showing him something on the rocks. It wasn't hard to miss, bright orange, with 5 legs. Minato might never have seen a starfish in person but he recognized it instantly. Kushina pushed his hand towards it, to show him he could touch it, and it felt as cold and hard as it looked. The other things on the rock were quite different and not so nearly recognizable, and when he touched one soft, squishy-looking pod thing, its little rubbery tentacles stuck like glue. An anemone, Kushina later explained, which was trying to eat his finger. Kushina wanted to go deeper, where the descending rocks met the bed of the bay and formed a field of colored rocks and swaying things that looked like plants but were in fact just more animals. Life teemed wherever he looked. Tiny colored fish flitted between rocks like sparkling jewels, or roved in packs. Crabs scuttling away from them into crevices, and Minato nearly had heart failure when he put his hand out on what looked like a rock, only to have it explode beneath his fingers into a very panicked octopus with 8 flailing limbs. He had to go up for air at that point, and Kushina joined him, laughing. "You should have seen your face. How can you laugh like that when I nearly died?" he asked, a touch dramatically. "There's nothing dangerous down there," she said. "Me and my friends used to come here all the time. If a bunch of 7-year-olds can cope, so can you, Minato." Well, when she put it like that. They dove again, and though Minato kept close to Kushina in case anything else decided to jump out at him, he couldn't deny there really was something incredible about this reef, as much as it was alien to him. He couldn't put a name to most of the things he saw, and some things he had never expected to see in his life, like little black seahorses that wound themselves around seaweed, or clams sitting on rocks, as large as life, inviting some idiot to stick his hand inside their jaws. Kushina stopped him, however, or sinister-looking eels that poked their heads out of holes to watch them swim past. Kushina's favorite were the little red fish whose fins fanned out like trailing silk, and Minato thought he understood why. Their scales and Kushina's hair were almost identical in color. Once they surfaced again Kushina told him, with her face glowing, that these were the very fish she'd told him about years ago, the ones she used to collect with her friends. "I'd collect some today if I thought they would survive the trip home," she said. "So you're going to come back to Konoha with me?" he asked. Her smile, so guileless and carelessly given a moment ago, dimmed a little. "Isn't that why you're here? To make sure I do?" She swam for the boat and pulled herself out of the water. Minato paddled after her quickly. "Only if you want to," he said, grabbed the side of the boat. In the act of wringing out her hair, she paused and glanced down at him. "What?" "Well, you always wanted to rebuild your village. If you wanted to stay and do that, I don't think there's much I could do to stop you. Then what are you here for, if you're not going to drag me back?" He shrugged. "Because Ren and the Hokage and even your sensei seem convinced that you're like some kind of loose cannon that's dangerous enough to blow at something totally used to Mifut. You're such a baby," Kushina admonished mildly, reaching down to pull him into the boat with her. They were both a little wet and slippery, and Minato rapidly forgot the thing in the water, which he was sure had been a kraken, in the ensuing tangle of naked slithering limbs. Somehow he ended up in the bottom of the boat while Kushina sat on the central bench, continuing to squeeze water out of her hair with a slight blush, eyes averted. "Well," he said, sitting up. "That was fun." He had meant their little undersea adventure, but the way Kushina now turned to scowl at him made him wonder if she thought he'd enjoyed their clumsy tussle a little too much. "I mean, it's not that. Do you think I'm dangerous?" she asked, interrupting him abruptly. After a thoughtful pause he shrugged, watching her just as closely as she watched him for his reactions. "I don't know. Are you?" It should have been a nonsensical question, but Kushina looked like she was chewing the inside of her cheek as she mechanically threaded her hair into a thick fishtail plait. He could tell she was worried. "I'm a pacifist," she said plainly, more to herself than to him. He didn't point out that some of history's most famous pacifists were also the most fearsome warriors of their time. He just said, "Absolutely. I've never seen you do anything dangerous. You put the knife in the toaster sometimes to get the toast out, but that's about it." "So? They didn't tell you why they think I'm dangerous?" "I'm not cleared to know, or something," Minato said, scraping water out of his own hair and ruffling it artfully until it stuck out in all directions. "I must have misunderstood something, though. He's probably just anxious to get you back because he thinks you're going to be his niece by marriage soon. If there was anything big going on, you'd tell me, wouldn't you?" Kushina was silent. Minato looked up at her and saw her staring off across the ocean, to where the horizon was beginning to turn orange with the sinking sun. "Kushina," he called softly. "You'd tell me, wouldn't you?" She swallowed and looked at him. Her whirlpool eyes had turned a dark blue that showed none of the lively green he was used to. He was so caught in them that he didn't notice how her hand pressed over her belly self-consciously, like she was worried he would see something he shouldn't. "I thought it would be okay if Ren knew," she said quietly, holding his gaze. "Ren changed a little while ago. He stopped treating me like he was my boyfriend, and more like he was my keeper, always wanting to know what I was doing, how I was feeling, where I was going. I thought it was just because he was jealous of you, but then his aunt, Biwako, took me aside and said that she had told Ren everything, because she thought he had a right to know since he was so serious about me. Now I know why it feels so weird being with Ren these days. He doesn't love me anymore. He's terrified of me. I couldn't stand it, so that's why I left." She raised her eyes to the remains of her village, and as she blinked, tears flashed down her cheeks. "Everything was such shambles that I thought I could return here and start rebuilding my life like it was before my father destroyed everything. It's stupid. But I was scared you would find out the truth too. I can take Ren turning his back on me, but if you did as well." He seized her damp hand in his. "I would never turn my back on you," he said fiercely. "Ren said the same kind of things until he knew the truth," she said, pulling away from his grip as she always did when she thought he was getting too close. "You don't know anything." "I don't care," he insisted. "Whatever it is, I don't care. You could tell me you're from another planet, and I wouldn't care. If you said you turn into a fiend during the full moon who can only survive of human blood, I'd get you all the blood you need if mine wasn't enough. If you have some kind of deadly plague, I don't mind if I catch it because I'd rather die with you than live without you. If your secret is so terrible that you have to flee the village, I would help you to hide, if that was what you wanted. And if you need to rebuild Whirlpool, I would get you all the bricks and timber you need and we could start tomorrow." Kushina stared at him with perfectly round eyes. "You'd rather die with me?" she squeaked. "Well," he conceded, "ideally, living with you for a very long and happy time is vastly more preferable." Dismayed, she wiped her cheeks. "You shouldn't say things like that." "But I feel them," he said firmly. "You shouldn't." "Not for me," she whispered. "You're amazing and strong and so brave and beautiful. Why would you ever have needed me as a friend? How can someone who can have anyone and anything in the world say things like that to someone like me?" He offered his hand to her, and was glad when she took it and wrapped her fingers so tightly around his that it felt like she was afraid to let go. "You're way more amazing than I am. When I came back from the war I didn't know what to do with myself, but you picked me up and set me on my feet like it was nothing. You gave my father a funeral and you made more of an effort to get to know him than I ever did. You stopped me from killing an innocent, and your cooking is way better than mine is. Also, you just saved me from a sea monster. It was just a bit of seaweed. My point stands. I am what I am because of you. You were the one who chose to be my friend, and I know how privileged I am for that. I'll always be here for you, whether you want me or not." She looked down at their joined hands and her thumb ran lightly over his knuckles. They'd shared affectionate touches before, and Minato liked to steal them whenever he could, but there was something deliberate about this that carried a weight neither of them were familiar with. Perhaps because they were both in their underwear. "I believe you," she said quietly at last. "And I do want you. Here with me, I mean. Coming back to this place was a bad idea. There's so much blood and bad memories it almost crushed me, until..." "Until?" he wondered. She looked up and smiled into his eyes. "You arrived." The enormity of her secret still hung over them, but it receded like a specter with the setting sun. Teams of tracker Nin were out searching for her right now. The Hokage was undoubtedly still losing hair over her disappearance, and Minato was as lost as ever as to how one girl could make a world leader sweat. He glanced at the figures in the distance, guarding the mouth of the Uzumaki river, but the shadows had closed over the island and it was impossible to make out the third headless figure, Kushina's father. He knew enough, for now at least, to know that the pain that engulfed the daughter's life was almost certainly down to the father. Kushina shifted down off her seat, still gripping his hand tightly. "Lie down with me," she said. "What?" Minato's pulse leapt in his throat. Spreading out their dry clothes on the rough boards beneath them, Kushina lay down and watched him expectantly until he settled beside her. The enormous sky stretched out above like a canopy of softly changing lights that turned from violet to pink, to yellow and red, and then a deep dark blue. Minato might have been fascinated by the show if he wasn't so acutely aware of Kushina beside him, and the heat of her hand in his, or the smooth bare skin of her arm pressed to his own. "This is why I love this place," she said, lifting her free hand to point at the heavens. "Look." The first star had appeared. Lulled by the size of the ocean and the gently rocking waves beneath them, Minato gradually began to relax and watched the show unfolding before his eyes. They said nothing as the sky deepened to black and the stars shone down like pinpricks of light puncturing the universe, and not just a few, or a few hundred, but thousands. Minato hadn't seen this many stars in his life. He'd never before bothered to stop long enough to notice. "This is the best place to see the stars, so far away from all the lights and pollution," Kushina said eventually, when they could even trace the Milky Way from one end of the sky to the other. "My mother used to say that every star represents a life. When you see a shooting star, it means someone has passed on. But there are new stars being birthed all the time. And there are millions more that you can't see with the naked eye just yet." "Which one are you?" he asked. She lifted their joined hands and pointed. "That one right there." "Where?" "That dim one next to that blazing bright one." "Nah," he said dismissively. "You'll be that one there." "That's the North Star," she protested. "So? My head isn't that big." "Then we'll be those two over there." "Huh?" "The two right next to each other, like they're lying together in a boat." Kushina moved her head closer to his to follow his pointing finger. "Oh, yeah," she murmured, with a soft laugh, and for a long time they lay, contemplating the stars with her head on his shoulder and her hand curled in his. She couldn't have known how fast his heart raced for her. At last she whispered, "We'll go back to Konoha tomorrow." He smiled, quite relieved despite his promise that he would stay and rebuild her village with her, stone by stone, if that was what she wanted. "Cool," he said, in an understated tone. Kushina turned her face to his to look at him, and instinctively he did the same. Their noses almost bumped but neither drew back. They'd been caught in a moment which might have been inevitable since the moment she accepted his hand, and they both knew what came next. Deep green eyes searched his, uncertainty tinged with hope, reflecting in his own. When their lips came together, Minato had never known anything like it. And from that point on, everything changed. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.